So if you were to tell me, hey, you can only use one EQ plugin for this record, what are you going to choose? Would be hands down.
Hey, this is James with GIK Acoustics, and we're here in beautiful Portland, Maine, and we're going to have a conversation with Adam Ayan, mastering engineer. Not often you get a chance to have a conversation with somebody who's one of the best in the world at what they do, and that's what we're doing today. Let's start with the early days of Adam, the audio geek.
Sure, yeah, absolutely, happy to. I'm of a generation where, you know, a huge music fan as a young person. MTV informed a lot of that for me early on, which led to me really being interested in becoming a musician. I'm a bass player. One of my bands had went into a local studio and cut a demo, and that was just eye and ear opening. That was an experience that I'll never forget. That was like, wow, we're in this space. We don't know what's going on in the outside world. We're having a blast making this record. Time's going by super fast. And I didn't know a lot about the technology in the studio world at that time. But fortuitous to me, very close by was the University of Massachusetts at Lowell, which has this amazing sound recording program. So post high school, that's what I did. Now, as I got into that program and as I got into the audio side of it and the recording side of it, my whole mindset shifted. So it became a thing where, you know what, I don't want to be a professional musician anymore. I want to be an audio engineer.
Right.
Eventually discovered mastering, which is still such a niche part of our industry. And back then we certainly didn't have classes, you know, about mastering.
Right.
But I started to learn about it and thought, oh gosh, that's looking like what I want to do. And so actually the genesis of that for me was I was very involved in our Audio Engineering Society student chapter, which was awesome. I was the president my senior year. And my main duty, my main job and responsibility was to invite professionals to come and speak. We held monthly meetings. And I got a really great crop of professionals to come and talk about what they did and give presentations to the student body. And one of them was Bob Ludwig. He had just opened Gateway up here in Portland a few years before. And that's what really piqued my interest. And I think it's this sort of like 10,000 foot view of the overall production, and maybe in part my beginnings as a huge fan of music that made it most interesting to me, the mastering process and being a mastering engineer. And I ended up getting wind actually through the director of the sound recording program at UMass about an opening at Gateway, and followed through with that and ended up, you know, I'm sure I was a pool of many people that interviewed for that position. It was a production position at the time, and ended up being the person lucky enough to get that gig. It started there in the summer of 1998. And within about a year became Bob's direct assistant. And within about a year of that, we both realized I had the aptitude to master. I had all the key components of, you know, somebody that could do that job, and started developing my own clientele. I was working in Bob's room around his schedule at the time. And then by August of 2001, so three short years from my start, we opened my mastering room at Gateway.
Nice.
And I spent 25 years there up until its closing in June of 2023, when I launched Ayan Mastering.
When you tell people you're a mastering engineer and they go, oh, what's that? How do you answer that question?
The short answer to that is I like to tell people that we're the end of the creative process of the making of a record and the beginning of distribution. You know, back in the day, we would have said specifically manufacturing of CDs, for example, or manufacturing of vinyl, which is still part of the deal. But we finalize the creative process, and that's what I'm doing day in and day out. And that's, of course, you know, what I love about this job. And that is taking the final two mix, in the case of stereo, and how can I make it sound better? And every recording is unique in terms of what the needs are and what it means for it to sound its best, right? So it's that final creative step, and then after a master is approved by a client, then we prep all the various master formats. I have an assistant named Griffin who's been doing a wonderful job for me. His job is to output all the final master formats from the approved mastering, listen to it all over headphones from top to bottom, make sure it's free of any audio defects, artifacts, any issues, before it gets into the distribution pipeline and into the ears of fans. On the creative side of things, I like to break that down. Usually a good analogy for most folks is, or maybe it's not even an analogy, a direct correlation to what mastering is with your consumer products, whether it be your car stereo, your iPhone, your home stereo, if you get into tweaking the tone controls or graphic EQ and that sort of thing, creatively, that's exactly what I'm doing to the mix in mastering, albeit with much more sophisticated tools. And the first third or so of my career, I quite often use what I would call a hybrid signal path. Whether I was given analog tape to master from or digital mixes, I would go through my analog signal path and do some processing there, then digitize again and do some processing there for the end result. That all changed for me about 15 years ago, where I challenged myself and sort of like as a test, can I do this all in the box with plugs? And I was really pleasantly surprised and kind of amazed that in doing so, I realized that working completely in the box, I was getting better results.
Yeah.
And for quite a while, somewhere between 6 and 9 months, I set up basically every session parallel processing, one hybrid versus all in the box, and every time all in the box was winning. Yeah. So in my final, 12 or so years, 12, 13 years at Gateway, I had all the gear as I have here, but it was off and I was using everything in the box.
Yeah.
As A&M mastering, both in my interim spot and here, these guys are here. I haven't used them and I haven't felt the need to. I want to keep them in case I want to, but I've been getting such better results in the box, whether it be emulations of these devices and or other plugs that are doing those sort of musical, more broad stroke type EQs, including, I mentioned the Pultecs because I use a lot of Pultec emulation in the box as well, that are affording me the one reason I would go out to the analog domain in those hybrid days, which were those broader stroke, mostly equalizers, almost always equalizers, broader stroke, really musical equalizers that at the time didn't have a corollary in the box, whether that was a direct emulation or just some other device that was providing me that kind of creative control. And once that changed, I found that working in the box afforded me to do those things that go out for hybrid and analog, not only afforded that, but then opened up new creative avenues and just better sonicness all around.
You're all in the box, so you're using plugins. What are everybody loves talking about plugins, right?
Sure.
So what are some of your favorites that you use a lot?
Well, in terms of equalization, I have a whole bunch of, at my fingertips to use, but one of my favorites, if you were to tell me, hey, you can only use one EQ plugin for this record, what are you going to choose? Would be hands down George Massenburg's MDW parametric EQ. It's like the Swiss Army knife of equalizers, and it sounds just amazing. So we can do the really fine-tuning things we call surgical in our business. It can do those things exceptionally well, but it also affords you to do much broader band EQ as well. So if I needed to stick with one, that guy would get me through everything I could possibly do. But in the real world, I'm using for the most part, several EQs. So some of my favorite in terms of the more broader stroke, quote unquote, musical, colorful things, I like to use the mainly massive passive a lot. The UAD emulation of that I think is really, really close to the real deal. I love the new Soundtech emulation EQ as well. That's really remarkable. I've always loved the Soundtech. So those are three of my favorite plugs on any given record, or those three. And then, of course, I have a grab bag of others that I really like as well. But young engineers or engineers just starting out that come to me and that ask for advice, I tell them, for the fun of it, this isn't real world, but this is for the fun of it and for bettering your ears and your overall mastering skills, just use EQ.
Yeah.
Don't do anything. Don't worry about level. Don't worry about the kind of levels that clients and listeners expect. Forget about that for a little while. Just put that aside and just work with equalization. And I promise you that will get you moving forward in leaps and bounds if you can sort of get that as your superpower first. And then add limiting and compression later, even if it's just like, hey, you're working on something and you need to do the dynamics processing as well, but you have the time, spend some time just working on EQ, because that is the bread and butter 100%. I, generally speaking, use limiting a lot. Generally a lot because I get a lot of really good mixes. A lot of the sort of more traditional compression is baked into the mix. But if I'm needing general compression, I really like the SSL emulations that are out there in the world. UAD has one that's remarkable. In fact, I kind of think sounds better than the hardware. Maybe that's controversial to say, but that I like a lot. And then limiting, I have, again, a grab bag of things. The Fab Filter stuff is really good. The isotope stuff is really great. There are a whole bunch of them out there. And I would also challenge anybody starting out to spend some time listening to those limiters for their color as well.
Yeah.
Because they all sound different. And of course, then you can affect them and change their parameters in a lot of them as well, but really get to know the color of your limiters. Again, like if you have a mix that needs a little bit of top end, maybe you get that mostly with EQ, but it ends up being a dance between that and limiting. Maybe you decide you want to use a limiter that's a little brighter. Or the converse of that, if you have something that is spot on in terms of brightness or overly bright, don't use that limiter that is bright because you're going to push it over the edge, right?
Yeah.
So those are some that I really like, but there are so many out there, and I do challenge folks to like make sure you know not only how they affect things in terms of that dynamic processing, but how they affect things overall EQ-wise, because they all do it a little differently. I've never been a mid-side engineer. It's never, whether in the analog domain or in the digital domain, it's never been a tool that I've trusted or liked. I've used it sparingly on occasion as sort of a fix kind of tool, but I can maybe think of less than a handful of times in my career I've used it. So I've never been a mid-side person. I do use some stereo widening. I think that there's some value in that, and there are a few really good ones out there. SPL makes a really good one in its Vitalizer. So stereo widening is a tool that I use very judiciously, but I do use a little bit in mastering. I do occasionally find that it can very easily be overused because there's a wow factor to it. And of course you can very easily get into phase issues that, and just generally speaking, things sound wonky and weird to me if somebody goes too far. So if I do use stereo widening, it's very small amounts.
Yeah.
I know saturation is a big deal for a lot of folks, but saturation and mastering, from my experience, I'm not going to judge anybody else, but from my experience, is usually a little too heavy-handed at that part in the process. A lot of the mixers that I work with, I know are using it on individual tracks or maybe on their mix bus, and that feels more appropriate there.
Yeah.
And it does amazing things. I love it. I think that that's been a game changer in some ways, but I don't necessarily think it's a game changer in mastering. But because we're doing such small moves, right? I've mentioned that a few times. It's really small moves that end up making big results. I'm always cognizant of my signal path from beginning to end and what's going on with it. So adding a new plug that I've never used before is always a thing where I do very carefully. And I try to spend as much time, understanding that plug and what things it may be doing or affecting that are aside from what I expected to do, that sort of thing. So everything is important. But number one, I'll just say that the most important thing to me are my ears. My ears and my ear brain, that's the whole thing. And that should be true of every audio engineer, mastering or otherwise. And any young people or new people starting out, I really encourage them, do internalize what good recordings sound like. And try to find a place where you can listen to where it's a good environment. Try to understand what that environment sounds like relative to others by listening to a lot of good recordings that you've internalized.
Yeah.
I've internalized thousands of recordings over the years that I've mastered, and prior to being a mastering engineer, I'd already internalized dozens or so recordings that I knew were great sounding recordings that were like my go-to if I'd walk into a new room. How does it sound? If I'm working on a record of similar vibe, like that, this record that I know sounds amazing might be a benchmark, that kind of thing.
Right.
So critical listening is hugely important, and what goes hand in hand with that, the most important thing next to my ears is the critical listening environment. It's the room itself. It's the speakers you choose. It's the interconnect between the speakers and the power amp you choose. It's the interconnect between the power amp and your console. It's the console. Yeah. It's everything in the signal path.
Right.
With, in my opinion, if I were to rank two things as number one, it's the room itself, the environment, and the speakers are two things most important to me. And I've been utilizing these Duntech Sovereigns virtually my entire career, and I've loved them. They're like my secret weapon to me. I know them so well, but they also are super, super neutral in flat frequency response. They're a big part of telling me how I used to say what the tape sounds like without imparting sound on the tape. Now it's, what the ones and zeros sound like without imparting sound to it in your listening. But then, of course, this room that we're in and the critical listening environment is just important as part of that system. The concept for me always was to build a room that was similar to my room at Gateway, yet if possible better sonically, and also aesthetically that reflected my creativity and my personality. So I took some of the design concepts of my room at Gateway, mainly the ratios of the room, the size of the room. We're on a floating floor here. We have double wall construction with a 1-inch air gap. Rock wool insulation everywhere in the floating floor, in the double walls, in the ceiling cavity. 2 layers of quiet rock sheetrock on the outside shell of the room, which is a very high STC rating sheetrock, much higher than your ordinary gypsum. Then in the inside of the room, resilient channel that, again, another 2 layers of quiet rock sheetrock is applied to with green glue in between.
Nice. Yeah.
And then same thing in the ceiling.
Yeah.
2 layers of quiet rock with green glue in between and a layer of OSB behind that. It's your recommendation, which was absolutely the right thing to do, so that we could hang all these wonderful sound blocks on the ceiling. And in fact, a side note about that, the ceiling ended up being one of the things that slowed the process down a little bit, because we had to really think about how we were going to create the ceiling. This is 10 foot from floor to ceiling finished, which is what I wanted, but the outside of the space goes up to 13 feet. And we knew we could do 10 feet, but we had to do it in such a way that would manage the load of OSB, 2 layers of quiet rock, and about 900 pounds of sound blocks. Right. And that ended up being a little bit of a trick for my contractor and a structural engineer and the owner of the building, who's also an architect, to figure out how to do that. Thankfully, this is a really old building built in 1900 with these big, beautiful timber joists above this ceiling that they were able to attach a matrix of 2x6s to.
This place was definitely a blank slate. It was an echo chamber, and we can. For me, that's exciting, because I know as an engineer, you hear that and you're like, hopefully it's going to be okay. But to me, I'm like, okay, here
that's
we
your
go.
challenge.
I know.
Yeah.
I know how this is going to come out, I think a lot of people would be surprised that we've got basically 3 GIK products in this room. That's it. We've got the Q7Ds on the back wall, diffusers. We've got the sound blocks, which we've talked a lot about. And then we've got the soffit bass traps in the corners. Those are all the devices we have here. And it's no coincidence that those devices, especially the sound blocks and the soffits, are the biggest, thickest devices we have. That's always a big question when I'm designing a room. How much space can I use to make it sound good? And for me, I'm 100% aligned with your vision of absorption in the front of the room, right? Because those are the early reflection zones, and we want to just get rid of those completely. We don't want to hear any reflections early on like that. And by early, I mean, within the first sort of 20 milliseconds or so. In other words, the sound from the speaker hits your ears, and then within 20 milliseconds, you hear the reflections coming from up or sides or whatever. And we want to just completely eliminate those as best we can. So big, thick absorbers is the way to go. And that's exactly what we have there. That's basically the design. And again, we're using sound blocks. A lot of them are freestanding. Some of them are mounted. Obviously, the ceiling devices are all mounted. And that's sort of a highlight of the design. That's more aesthetic, where we just kind of got them tilted at the 45-degree angle.
Kind of diamond-like.
Yeah, the diamonds, exactly. And that's a good look. The installer did such a great job, and it just looks really, really cool in here. Adam, thanks for having us in today. Thanks for the conversation. It's going to be great. Mastering, it just has such a reputation of being this arcane art form, that you have these wizards in their caves doing the work on. And here's a wizard in his cave, and it's an amazing space to be. So, thanks for your time today. It's been a delight working with you through this. I'm so glad that, we've delivered a room that you love, and that's the name of the game. And I want to listen to some stuff now.
Yeah, thank you so much for visiting today. And thank you, James and GIK, for all the help and guidance you've given me in building this room. It was a huge component to this whole design. And I'm just so thrilled with the way it turned out. So let's hop offline and listen to some music.
Heck yeah, I'm down.